It was very good to sing about the love of God. Good morning, everyone. How are you all today? You're good. You can preach next week, okay? I'm never good on a Sunday, all right? But it's lovely to have you all here. If you don't know me, my name is Gary. Very good to have you here this morning. When I was about 19, I think, or 20, I had a minor arson event in my life. So I'll tell you the story and what I learned from it. So my dad had bought me a 3-ton lorry for me to put my horses in to go to the shows that I used to go to. And he had it converted to carry, I think it was about 4 or 5 horses. And it was due to go to a show, so we had a big yard. So I drove the lorry onto our front garden to give it a wash. And so I'd scrubbed the thing clean and everything was all good, and it was parked on the front lawn. And it did have a problem. Now, I'm not mechanical, so I'll tell it to you in my simple terminology, okay? It used to get airlocks. And what that meant was they would get an airlock in the fuel pipe and it would not fire up and run. But I'd been told by a mechanic what to do. So it was a fairly old lorry. The engine was in a compartment between the 2 seats. So it was here, sitting in the lorry, it was there. So you'd open the lid of the engine compartment. You would open up the carburetor. How many of you don't know what a carburetor is? Okay. Yeah, I'm with you on that one, all right? You open it up and then you would take a jar of petrol, you pour a cap full of petrol and you'd pour it into the carb. And then you would start the engine. And what it would do is the engine would cause a spark, which would ignite the petrol you've put in the carb, which would then ignite, combust, cause a vacuum, and suck the airlock out the car. And then you'd shut everything up and you'd be good to go. So I went and collected a jar of petrol, got into the lorry, sat on the seat, opened up the engine, put some, I'll do the movements for you, okay? Here's the jar of petrol, here's the cap. Pour some in the cap, hold the jar of petrol here, pour it into the engine, right? Hold the jar of petrol here, start the engine. So I started the engine, and a spark did jump out of the carb, did ignite the petrol that was in the carb, but that combusted and blew up everywhere. And just one of those little sparks of ignited petrol landed in the jar of petrol that I was holding, which then exploded. So in a split second after the flash had disappeared, I discovered my entire arm was on fire with the petrol. So in my haste, I remembered we did have a swimming pool in the front garden. It was Africa. I dropped the jar of petrol in the car and hightailed it off to the swimming pool and dived into the swimming pool. So when I surfaced, I turned around to look at the vehicle, and of course I had dropped the jar of burning petrol in the vehicle, which the vehicle was now on fire, you see. But fortunately, because it was petrol, it burnt pretty quickly, and the vehicle lived to tell the tale, bar for burnt upholstery and burnt carpets, which I lived with for the rest of my life. But it's quite funny because as I'm getting older, I've discovered a particular problem. The skin on my arms is not such good condition anymore, particularly this arm. And I've always wondered, why is this? I put it down to that, probably that arson event. But you know, these memories I have of these disastrous decisions I've made in my life, they were critical in the formation of my early Christian faith. Because what I became really convicted of when I was a young Christian was my bad choices in life. And you know that guilt and remorse I used to feel over these stupid decisions I had made, it produced in me 2 things. Number one, it was there that I fell in love with God. Because I then began to realize that this God who I'd put my faith in loved me in spite of my many failures. And I had never come across somebody who loved me like that. And that is where my love for him was birthed, that he could love me and forgive me for the stupid things I'd done. But the second thing it produced in me was this intense desire to not be an idiot for the rest of my life and to be able to make better choices. How many of you have been on a similar journey, okay? It's just like, don't let me be an idiot for the rest of my life, you know. And so I think for all of us, decision making and how to make good decisions in life is critical. Do you know, I remember doing a course when I was a young Christian, and they taught us this principle that many of our choices start with a thought. So we have a thought, we make a decision, we take an action based on that decision. That action and that process, if repeated, forms habits in our lives. Those habits form our character. And our character determines the direction and destiny of our lives. Staggering. And it all starts going back to those thoughts and those decisions. And you know, I think if any of us ever hope to have a life that's meaningful, we have got to retrace some of our steps and go back to that place of how we make decisions so that we can try and aim for the best possible outcome for our lives. That, having said it, is somewhat doable when life is easy, but not easy when life is difficult. Making decisions when you're under pressure can be enormously challenging. And so I think for all of us, that pressure point, that testing time for all of us, are those moments when we're under pressure as to what decision we will make. And you know, folks, I think it's true for all of us, that sometimes in that process of thinking, making a choice, that becoming a habit, that forming part of your character, sometimes in that whole process, the only way we can identify as to what's in our character that's being formed is to put us under pressure, because what comes out of us at that time is indicative of the character we've formed. So pressure can be terribly revealing. I don't believe pressure breaks anything. It just simply exposes what's inside of us. And so under pressure, that is the best time for evaluation of our lives, because it exposes what's inside of us and brings it out into the open. So when we're under pressure, the kind of decisions we're making, we've got to stop there and say, wait a minute, is this the way it's meant to be? And then reevaluate and see what we can do. Today, I wanted to talk about how we can make good decisions in life. But I wanted to set it in a particular context of a war story. And I chose this because, it's an incredible story, but it also is an intense time of pressure on the people that we are going to hear. I don't know. No. I think some of you, how many of you lived through Second World War? Okay. So some of you will have that memory and that experience. How many of you have no experience of war or fighting whatsoever in your life? Yeah. So the problem we'll have with the story is we're going to struggle to even empathize with the pressure these people were under. Now, I've tried to reflect on my own life, how I would relate to the story. I think I relate to the failure more than the story itself, but for all of our growing up years in Africa, Hazel and I, we lived in a country that had an internal war for our entire growing up years. And so we lived under that awful shadow of war. And I have memories of, I can't remember where we were headed. Some of the roads in the country were okay, some were not, but I remember an occasion where as a family we were going somewhere, and the only way we could get down this road was to go extremely fast. And one of my parents, I can't remember who, had to drive, and the other one sat with a gun in case we were shot at on this road. And that's about the closest we came, bar for the violence in the country towards the end, which was worse. That was about the closest we really came to being that close to war. So I don't know if we can empathize with the pressure these people were under, but we're going to jump into the story. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use what we learned from that story as a catalyst to say, okay, how are we supposed to make choices in life? How do we make choices that are for the best outcome for our lives. How can we do that? So that's where we're going to head today. So folks, we're going to pick up in the story, okay? It's in Joshua chapter 9. So the story here is the small nation of Israel. There might have been about 1 million people, we're not entirely sure. God has set them free from being slaves in Egypt, and he's promised them a land to go to which would be their own home. The problem is that has stirred up enormous hostility from the surrounding nations. So they've been having some pretty good success at this point, but then trouble mounts up, and we're going to pick up on the story, okay? Joshua 9, we're going to do it in stages, all right? So we read the first 2 verses. Now when all the kings west of the Jordan heard about these things, those in the hill country, in the western foothills, and along the entire coast of the Great Sea, as far as Lebanon, and the kings of all these people, the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, all of those nations, the lot of them ganged up together to come and wage war against this nomadic tribe who had nowhere to go. And they came together to make war. How many of you have had thoughts of what we would do in our country if we ended up in war, if we were invaded? I mean, it goes through your head. Can you imagine the pressure? You're nomads, you've got nowhere to run to, and all the nations around you ganged up against you. I can't imagine the pressure they were under. Okay, let's carry on with the story. Verse 6 to 13, this is what happens. Verse 3 to 5. However, when the people of Gideon, this is another crowd, heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, where they'd had a victory, they resorted to a ruse. They went as a delegation whose donkeys were loaded with worn-out sacks and old wineskins, cracked and mended. The men put worn and patched sandals on their feet and wore old clothes, and the bread of their food supply was dry and moldy. So they are now actively going to go there to try and deceive Joshua and the crowd. So they're neighbors. They're one of the crowds that God had told Joshua to get rid of them out of the land, okay? And they knew that. So they developed this deception. And they go armed with a delegation to go and speak to Joshua. And this is what happens, verse 6 to 13. Then they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and the men of Israel, "We've come from a distant country." Lie. "Make a treaty with us." You see, if they were in a distant country, they didn't come under the category of needing to be removed. The men of Israel said to the Hivites, "But perhaps you live near us." How many of you found that sometimes your first instinct is right? That first instinct was right. "How can we then make a treaty with you?" Verse 8, "We are your servants," they said to Joshua. But Joshua asked, "Who are you and where do you come from?" This niggle, something didn't quite feel right. They answered, "Your servants have come from a distant country," pressing with that lie. "Because of the fame of the Lord your God, we heard of the reports of him and all he did in Egypt and all that he did to the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, and these people. And our elders and all those living in our country said to us, 'Take provisions for your journey. Go and meet them and say to them, we are your servants. Make a treaty with us. This bread of ours was warm when we packed it at home on the day we left to come to you. But now see how dry and moldy it is.'" Do you know, folks, you know what is so interesting in this story? All the visible information stacked up with the lie. The only thing that didn't stack up was their niggle inside of them, that they thought there might be something wrong here. How many of you face dilemmas like that, where the decision you're needing to make is such a difficult one? You don't know whether to go with the information that's been presented to you. Do you rely on what's in your heart? How do you make that decision? Okay, well, let's see what happens. Verse 13, they continue to say, "And these wineskins that we filled were new, but see how cracked they are, and our clothes and sandals are worn out by the very long journey." All an absolute lie. So we pick up the story in verse 14 to 16. This is the learning curve for you and I. The men of Israel sampled their provisions, which all stacked up with the story. But they did not inquire of the Lord. Then Joshua made a treaty of peace with them to let them live, and the leaders of the assembly ratified it by oath. 3 days after they made the treaty with the Gibeonites, the Israelites heard they were neighbors, and they knew they'd been had. But they had to stick by their decision, and they had to honor that because they had made it. But it was a failure for them as a nation. And the reason why? It said it. They did not stop to ask God what he thought. Do you know, folks, if you're to remember anything from today, remember that one thing. They didn't inquire of God. And we need to know why that is so critical. Do you know, the only person in the entire universe who knows the truth about everything, who has the wisdom to know what decision to make for the best outcome, is God. You can see from this story how easily you and I can be misled and deceived by circumstances and by things out there. Whether it be culture, whether it be social media, whether it be public opinion, whether it be someone giving you counsel. We can be completely misled. The only safeguard is to default to God and say, God, what would you say? And ask him. Do you know, folks, I don't know what you've learned about decision making in your life. This is what I've learned. Your emotions are not reliable for guidance. Your desires are not reliable for guidance. Our cultural influences in our country are not reliable for guidance. The devil will do his utmost through things around us to deceive us because he wants to cause our downfall. And well-meaning people can give wrong advice. And sometimes our own character, the things we've built into our character, can mislead us. There's only one person who cannot mislead us, and that's God. That's why this story is so powerful. It teaches us to inquire of God. So folks, see for your life this morning. See in your decision making, okay? If you had to inquire of God and ask him what he thinks, how would you tell if he's answered you? How would you know what he's saying? This becomes the critical thing for our Christian lives, is how do we get an answer from God? How do we hear that? How do we know that? I want to share with you some two scriptures that just are challenging for you and I on what we have to aim at in our lives, okay? Have a look at this one, Psalm 23. Which you all know, this wonderful psalm, the first 3 verses. Look at what it says here. It says, the Lord is my shepherd. He's your shepherd. You will not be in want. He will make you lie down in green pastures. He will lead you. He'll lead you. He'll go ahead of you and lead you. Beside quiet waters, he restores my soul. He will guide you in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Somehow, practically in our lives, we've got to be able to get to the place where it's, how do I know? How do I get guidance from God? How do I get that? And then this last one, John chapter 10, verse 4. This was massively inspirational to me as a young Christian. John 10, verse 4 says, talking about Jesus being the shepherd, it says, when he has brought out all his own sheep from the pen, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow because they know his voice. See that whole dynamic. That needs to become our personal experience. Okay? He goes ahead of me. I don't choose my own way. I follow him. And I can follow him because I can hear his voice. I know how to get guidance from him. And so I follow him. That for me is the way to live life well and to make good choices that we will have no regrets on. So we've got to work out how to do that. One of the best stories I heard, which I think is the best I could come up with in talking about this, was a story I read many years ago about a particular harbor. Now this harbor where ships needed to come in to port, into this harbor area, had a very narrow channel accessible for big boats. And that either side of this channel, under the water, there were rocky outcrops and reefs and all kinds of dangerous things. So on the surface of the water, you couldn't see them, but they were under there. So they had to figure out a way of trying to get these ships safely through the deep section where there were no reefs. So you know what they did? On the bank, going up a hill on the other side of the harbor, they built a series of lights, I can't remember how many it was, a series of lights running up the hill that they would put on. And the way it would work is this: if you were a boat trying to get into the harbor, if you could position yourself when all those lights were in a straight line, and you positioned yourself there, that was the entrance to the harbor. If the lights were not in line, the wrong entry point. So you had to line up all the lights, and then you knew you were good to go. I've come to see guidance like that. That to hear from God and to know how to make good decisions, we need to line up a bunch of different things in our lives to make sure we've heard right. And I want to share some of them with you today, okay? I'm going to share 6 things with you. Most of them I managed to get to begin with a P, except 2 of them I couldn't, okay? So some of them are going to be P's, all right? So I'm going to talk to you about the first thing. So let's imagine you have to make a major decision in your life, all right? How are you going to do that? All right, principle number 1, okay? It's this: go by principle. Not emotion, not comfort, not feeling, not reaction. Go by principle. What does the Bible say? Have a look at this verse. I was having a chat to my son the other day about this, and he gave me a definition, and it's absolutely brilliant. John chapter 1, verse 1. It's a simple verse talking about the beginning. And it says this: in the beginning was the Word. So we believe that to refer to Jesus. It's also about the words God spoke in creation when he spoke the world into existence. And it says, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And my son told me he looked up the definition of the word word. And you know what it means? An ordering principle. So in other words, the Bible tells us in the beginning when God created the world, it was all chaos. There was no order. And God spoke and brought about order in the world he had created. And so God's words, the Bible, the effect that has on our lives is an ordering principle. It puts our lives in the right order. So the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, what principles are there in the Bible that relate to this decision I need to make? And go by that. In other words, if you can train yourself to be a person who lives by principle, not emotion, and not reaction, you are going to position your life to be absolutely grounded on things that won't fail you. Okay, so that's the first consideration. What principle applies here? So you've got to read the Bible and find it, okay? Find out what it says to do in that situation. Okay, we all good? Number 1, principle. Okay. Number 2, prophecy. So let's say you had to make a decision. Thankfully, in our church, we believe in prophecy. Have there been any supernatural things in your life which have suggested to you something you ought to be doing? Let me show you a verse here, all right? Joel chapter 2, verse 28, a famous Old Testament prophecy that was fulfilled on the day of Pentecost. This is what it says. God was predicting a time where he said, afterwards I will pour out my Spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams. And your young men will see visions. God was talking about ways he would speak to people. So what is a prophecy? A prophecy is someone standing up like in our service today and saying something like, I believe God is saying this. In other words, they're not reading out the Bible. Something inside of them is saying they believe God is saying this. So someone could one day come to you and say, I feel God is saying this about you or to you. So you'd have to stop and think, have I had anything like that? Any suggestions that have come to me through a dream? I think most of you will know our story, that our whole trigger in leaving Zimbabwe was because of some terrible dreams I had, where they were so disturbing that I was convinced, after reflecting on them, because I couldn't get them out my head, I made a decision to believe that they were from God. And to interpret it, there was no other way to interpret it except terrible trouble was coming, people were going to be killed, and we would have to get out the country. And 9 years later is exactly what happened. So we've got to take on board dreams, write them down if you think they're significant. Now you can't act on just that, okay? We've got to get all the lights in a line, right? So you can't just run by that one, all right? And here's a balance for you. This is my take on it. Genesis 41 verse 32, when Pharaoh had dreams when Joseph was in Egypt, listen to what this verse says. Joseph speaks to Pharaoh and he says, the reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in two forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God and God will do it. So I've always worked on the basis, if ever I get a feeling or a thought or a dream or an impression or something like that that has not come from principle in the Bible, I always say to God, okay, God, if that is you, you need to give it to me a second time. I'm not going by just one, okay? That could be cheese. Too much cheese before I went to bed, okay? I don't trust that. So I always work on the basis, it's got to be more than once. So ask him, say it again, another way. And if you get it a second time, then you know you're onto something. Okay, so principle. Prophecy. This is the third one. This is something that we've used our entire lives. What gives you peace in your heart? Have a look at this verse. Colossians 3 verse 15 says, let the peace of Christ rule or be the umpire in your heart. So let the peace of God be the umpire in your heart. In other words, if you've got to make a decision between two options, which we have been fraught with that decision making so many times, Hazel and I will go and we'll pray. We'll pray about the one option, we'll pray about the second option, and we gauge inside of us which one gives us more peace. You know, one of the things that happened when our last few months in Zimbabwe were absolute crisis for us. We were under such threat economically, socially, secure, every possible way. And a man from South Africa who had a church down there contacted us and he said, look, I'll get your money out the country, I'll pay for you, you come down and come and work with us in Cape Town, beautiful part of South Africa. It was the only offer we'd had to escape. And Hazel and I went and we prayed. So on this hand we had nothing, and on that hand we had his offer. And you know, we prayed and we absolutely had no peace whatsoever to say yes to him. And that's what we went by. So we said no. And it was the right decision. But we said no because we didn't have peace about it. So do you have peace about the decision you're making? Okay. Number 4. And I've used the word petition. Petition someone. Ask someone their opinion. Okay, this is something you can do. Proverbs 12 verse 15 says, the way of a fool seems right to him, but a wise man listens to advice. Now, folks, can I tell you something in our Christian circles here about what I believe about advice? Okay? I believe if you are ever to give someone advice, I don't believe it's ever right that you tell someone what to do. And I'll tell you why. Okay? If I said to Bill and Lillian today, I think you need to sell your house and go and live in a caravan. That's my advice. Who bears the consequence for that choice? Me or them? Them. So therefore, I have no right to come over with a strong opinion on what they should do because I don't bear the consequences. So I believe that you've got to be very careful in giving people advice. I would say something like, well, I might do this. What do you think about that idea? See, I'm giving an opinion. I'm not telling them what to do. And I think when you go to someone to ask them, it should be that, what's your opinion on this? I'm keen to hear your opinion. I don't want you telling me what to do, but I am keen to hear your opinion. I'll decide what I'm going to do. I'm just keen to hear your opinion. Doesn't that feel safe? Absolutely safe, you see. So we should have someone in our life that we can say, what would you do in this situation? What would you tell me? Then you collect the information, and now you've covered another territory. What if you're blind and you can't see something? You might need someone to say, whoa, hold on here, have you thought about this? So asking someone's opinion is a good thing. Okay. Number 5, and this is where I think we've got to do this too. Use your brain. Think. Evaluate your options. Carefully consider each one, the fors and against. So I don't know how you would do that in your life. Okay? How do you rationally think through it, choices you've got to make? For Hazel and I, when we were newly married, we'd had our 2 daughters. We were offered an opportunity to go and lead a church on the eastern border with Mozambique. And we had felt for a season that we might move, so we felt it inside. There were a few suggestions that we might move. So in order to put that into practice, we said to them, right, we can't give you an answer until we've come up to visit. So we went up there. We went and visited the school. We asked for a walk around the school. We went and visited the church. We went and sat in one of the services. We met with the people after the church. We explored that option thoroughly to see what it would be like. And I think we've got to do that. We've got to use our brains. Okay? Evaluate your options. And number 6, and this one I really want to sell this to you, this one, okay? So if you've done all those things, right, so the first one was principle, establish a biblical principle, consider prophecy or dreams or something where God has supernaturally spoken to you, consider what option is giving you peace. Ask for someone's advice, and not everyone will get that right, by the way. Not everyone will get that right. Consider your options. And the last one is, this is the acid test. If you come after having done all those things to make a decision that you believe God is guiding you to make, then all of God's resources and backing will come into play with that decision you're making. And He will open doors for you, and it will work. God's provision will be there for you when you make that decision. And folks, this Hazel and I, we count it an absolute privilege to face the horrors we faced in Africa because of what we experienced. I'll just share a short story for you. Once we became convinced that we were going to have to leave the country, and we believed it was the UK, it was utterly impossible for us. But I'll tell you some of the stories of the things that happened for us that we believed God was telling us, that we would have to get out of Zimbabwe and go to the UK. So these are the things that began to happen. Okay. Number one, we could not leave because the title deeds for our house had been lost by the government. We had no money. We had to sell the house to get the airfares to get out of the country. So we were absolutely stuck. Our lives were coming to such an unraveling end that Hazel and I fasted for 3 days. We ate nothing for 3 days, and we prayed and said, God, you've got to do something. We're absolutely stuck. The moment we finished that fast, I got a phone call. And the woman said, my sister's been praying for you in South Africa. She had a word from God for you. So I said, what is that? And she said, it's time for you to sit under someone else's ministry. That was the first time we had any evidence that this was the season we might have to move. So the moment I finished that phone call, I prayed and I said, God, that might be all well and good, but we can't go. We're stuck. We can't sell our house. We don't have the title deeds. That was on a Wednesday. That weekend on the way to church, we went to the post office where our mail was stored, collected our post, and then there was a letter from our lawyer saying, guess what? They found the title deeds for your house. We've got them. You can come and get them. Just at the time we had to have it. So that we were convinced we're hearing right. It got worse, because then we had to sell the house. So by the time we ended up having to move, we had about 8 weeks to get here for the start of school. And we needed 6 weeks to sell the proceeds of our house and everything. So it was extremely tight. So we put our house on the market, and it was sold within days. So it felt this wonderful relief, like, yes, God's coming through for us. The house has been sold, everything's moving, we've heard right, we're going. 2 weeks later, the sale of the house fell through. And now we've got no spare time whatsoever. It's got even worse. And we had nothing, we had no choice but to pray and trust God. Well, it was so pressurizing. The last week, we were due to fly on the Saturday. By that Monday, we'd got no money for the sale of our house yet. We had to pay government taxes, we had to pay for airfares, and we got a portion of the money on the Monday. Not enough for the airfares, not enough for the tax. I remember praying and saying, God, what do we pay first? And I felt God say, pay the airfares first. So we paid the airfares on the Monday. They went up by 40% on the Tuesday. and we finally got the last bit of money on the Wednesday, paid the government, got our tax clearance, and flew out on the Saturday. But it's the kind of thing that God does when you line your life up with what He says to do. He comes through. And folks, the most wonderful thing that we have learned from our terrible times we've been in is this. If we prioritize the will of God in our lives, there is nothing that God can't do with us. No way He cannot come through if you prioritize God's will for your life. It is the greatest security you could hope for in life, is to do life God's way, not your own. There's nothing that He cannot do. Amen?